morning. I know there are many competing events going on in town today, it being September 11th and the day after Obama's major policy speech. So we're very grateful that you're here today, but I think at the same time it speaks volumes about how there is what we like to call a rebalance within Asia, and that rebalance very much hinges deeply on the two biggest democracies in the region, namely India and Japan. There has been a lot of excitement over the Prime Ministers Modi and Abe summit meeting in Tokyo a fortnight ago. And there were considerable developments both on the economic as well as the security front. On the economic front, we are expecting Japan to more than double its FDI into India. We're expecting more private investments to go into India. We're expecting more partnerships for growth on both sides. And we are also expecting greater cooperation on the security front, especially in the maritime arena. But the question really then becomes, what does this mean in the longer term? Does this latest development actually have legs? And especially in light of the numerous challenges within Asia, not only the rise of China itself, but also the changing dynamics within both Japan and India. What are we looking to in the future? Here to answer many of these questions is a panel of people who have traveled very far to be with us today. From my right, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Makoto Kojima, who is a professor of Indian economic studies at Takushoku University. He was a chairman of the study group on India at the Japanese Finance Ministry, and he was a member of the Japan-India Joint Study Group as well. He's the author of numerous publications, and he has a doctorate from Keio University. Next to him is Pratap Banu Mehta, who is the head of the Center for Policy Research. He is the recipient of numerous prizes, most recently the Amartya Sen Prize in 2012. He's also received the Infosys Prize, and he's received all these awards because he is really one of the preeminent big thinkers on the Asia-Pacific region. To his left, to your right, is Satoru Nagao, who is an associate of the Tokyo Foundation and a lecturer on national strategy at Gakushuin University. And he was a former research fellow with the Japan Forum for Strategic Studies and also a fellow at the Ocean Policy Research Foundation. And next to him is Tomoko Kiyota, who currently is enviably based in Hawaii. She's a resident Sasakawa Peace Foundation Fellow at Pacific Forum CSIS until next year, where she is focusing her research on Indo-US-Japan trilateral relations. She's also worked at the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She's been a visiting fellow at Manipal University, and she will be completing her PhD from Takushoku University very soon. And finally, but certainly not least, is Saurabh Gupta. He is actually the only panelist here who's based in Washington. He is a senior research associate at Samuels International Associates, and he focuses on US-India, China-India, and Japan-India bilateral relations, as well as political security and economic risk evaluation of key players in the Asia-Pacific region. So I hope we can start this conversation today by asking Professor Kojima to discuss a little bit about the economic angle of the Japan-India relation and where it's going. What can we see?
Good afternoon. My name is Kojima. It's my great pleasure and honor to be here and have a chance to talk. Today, my topic is a new phase of Japan-India economic relations as natural partners. Excuse me. これはちょっとすいません。これは一緒にやっちゃう。これはこうやったらですね。こうそうです。こちらですね。Sorry. Japan and India has a long history of economic interactions since Japan embarked on modernization in major area in late 19th century. However, after the World War II, as Japan recovered from the World War and made a remarkable economic growth, Japan's relations with Asian countries has been focused on East Asian countries. So the Indian-Japan economic relation have not been so major. But India embarked on economic reforms along with Look East policy in early 1990s. Since then, India's relationship between East Asian countries have expanded. But as far as Japan-India relations are concerned, it's only the past 10 years the relationships have expanded. The recent Mr. Modi visit Japan to Japan attracted many popularities, and it hit the headline. It heralded the, I think, the new area of bilateral relationships. Today, I'd like to talk about how Japan-India relations have been expanded in the recent years, covering various aspects of the bilateral economic relations. Well, as natural partners, both countries share the values. First, Buddhist thought. Buddhism was introduced into Japan in the late 6th century. Since then, Indian way of thinking penetrated Japanese people. And second, liberal democratic values. Only Japan and India had been major democratic countries for a long time since World War II. And both countries have a warm nature of bilateral ties, free of any dispute, including historical grievances. And the recent visits of Emperor and Empress to India last year, accompanied by the Prime Minister Abe's visit to India as the chief guest of Republic Day this January 2000, this highlighted the very intimate relation between two countries. The visit of emperor to foreign countries is very rare and very calibrated. And both countries have a very complementary nature of economies. India have abundant human resources and huge market. On the other hand, Japan has technological prowess and capital resources. So these combine to show that both countries are natural partners. Just quick brief review of bilateral economic relations. In pre-war period, both Japan and India are partners and competitors. Japan made industrialization in the area of textile and steel. In those areas, India is a very formidable competitor to Japan. Besides, they had some joint work. Tata and NYK line joined hand in launching regular services between Bombay and Kobe for supply of raw cotton to Japan in 1893 in competition with their P&Q, the dominant shipping line. And in the pre-war, in Japan-India relationship quite large, India accounts for the 10 to 15% of total Japanese foreign trade until 1937. And post-war period, from 1950 to mid-60s, India was an important supplier of iron ore for Japan. It was very important for the Japan revival of steel industries. But from the mid-60s to 1990, the Japan India trade was marginalized because India had inward-looking policies, and Japan expanded with relationship with East Asian countries very expanding. After 1991, when India introduced economic reform, we had some chance to expand bilateral relations, but Japan took sanctions against India for conducting nuclear tests in 1999-8. Thereafter, it had got a setback. Well, it only in mid-20s, 21s, that India had the largest recipient of Japanese ODA since 2003. Sorry. Sorry. Well, this shows the India trade with East Asia since the early 21st century. The trade with Eastern countries have increased, but the Indian-Japan trade have not so expanded. The Indian-China trade surpassed Japan-India trade in 2002. So as far as the trade is concerned, India-Japan trade showed the upward trend since 2003, but lagging far behind India trade with ASEAN and China. Currently, Japan ranks 16th as India's trading partner, and India ranks only 23rd as Japan trading partner. In August 2011, India-Japan EPA came into effect, but impacts have not been so far modest. Well, for the future expansion of bilateral trades, I think the production of production network covering the two countries through vigorous FDI activities is a key to the expanding bilateral trade between two countries. We can have a more positive picture in FDI inflow into India. This was the investor to India from 2006 to 2013. Japan comes fourth. This shows the Japanese companies in India. Currently, it exceeds 1,000. It's steadily increasing. Well, Japanese companies are reluctant to invest into India, reluctant investors into India, influenced by the harsh image of India's poor infrastructure and red tape. Japanese FDI into India has shown to increase since around 2007, recognize India as a promising destination of investment. So currently, the Japanese FDI into India increased, but also it widening a firm presence of Japanese automobile assemblers, attracted steel and logistic companies to invest into India, and electronics appliance companies such as Matsushita or Panasonic, Sony are now making strenuous efforts to catch up with Korean companies. And Japanese companies have entered into various fields of goods necessary for daily life, including food, stationery, cosmetics, and sanitary goods. And also, financial institutions made a big investment into India. The financing fund to Indian companies and financing infrastructure projects. In India, expectation for Japanese FDI is very high. The typical example is Maruti Suzuki. It revolutionized the Indian automobile industries. The expansion of Japanese FDI into India is highly expected to bolster the Indian manufacturing sector by bringing high quality production base and also upgrading the skill level of labor. There are the growing tendency among Indian manufacturing companies to learn from Japan to improve their total quality management. Currently, the total of 6 industrial parks dedicated to Japanese companies are being set up in Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Tamil Nadu. And if we look at the infrastructure, it's more positive. Japanese ODA has been instrumental in improving Indian infrastructure, as well as encouraging Japanese FDI into the field of infrastructure. Japan had already left footprint in Delhi Metro. Japanese collaboration in Delhi Metro contributed to plant a new construction culture, the concept of safety and the appointed time of delivery. And now, Indian government intended to construct the major industrial corridors, 6 industrial corridors, to become a global manufacturing hub. Over the 6 industrial corridors, Japan has been committed to the 2 corridors, Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor, DMIC, and second, Chennai-Bengaluru Industrial Corridor, CBIC. The DMIC projects has already started. And there another possibility is the high-speed train network, bullet train. Japan is expected to be associated with the most promising 534 kilometers Mumbai-Ahmedabad sector. The feasibility study is now going on between Indian Railway and Japan International Cooperation Agency. Now I focus on the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. The vision of the DMIC is to build industrial cities with world-class infrastructure across 6 states along western India. 7 of them will be built for phase 1 by 2019. The idea of promoting DMIC was endorsed at the Japan-India Summit meeting in December 2006. The dedicated freight corridor, rail freight corridor, constitutes the backbone of the DMIC. Japan confirms to provide 450 billion yen loan to the phase 1 of DFC at the summit meeting in 2008, and pledges $4.5 billion loan to the DMIC project at the summit meeting in 2011. Up to now, Japan has already presented 18 prospect projects for constructing environmental-friendly smart communities. The project of water desalination and water supply to Dahej, Gujarat, was finalized in January 2013. Probably their construction work will start next year. This is the DMIC corridor. The red line is the dedicated freight corridor. 24 industrial cities will be built. Look at the dedicated freight corridor. The western DFC, eastern DFC is between Delhi and Kolkata. Western DFC, Japan take care of it. Provide a safe and efficient transportation system covering a distance of 1,490 kilometers of double-line electric track. The transportation time will be reduced from 3 days to 1 day, and the freight volume per train will be increased by 3.6 times. The Japanese companies play the prime contractors for each contract package under the special terms for economic partnership loan. After the long period of preparation, the construction work for Phase 1, the Rewari-Badora line, final studies September last year. The DFC is expected to be partially open by 2017 and followed soon by the Phase 2. Just look at the Japanese IT offshoring to India. India is an IT big company, but their Indian exports to Japan has not increased. Japan accounts for still less than 2% of total Indian IT exports. Why Indian IT companies struggle in Japan? Many factors: language barriers, culture misunderstanding, scarcity of Indian residents in Japan. And when Japan offshoring, we prefer to turn to China because there are many Chinese IT engineers proficient in Japanese languages. But new trend among Japanese companies started to tap Indian IT capabilities. Under pressure to globalize their business, Japan companies are more likely to tap Indian IT companies either by tying up with Indian IT companies or setting up their own captive centers. For example, Nissan had a relationship with TCS as a co-development partner, and it has a R&D center, big R&D center in India. And quite recently, TCS started joint venture with Mitsubishi company. It has an employee of more than 2,000. Probably it will be a very promising project from now on. So the current situation is changing. Well, Japan and India formed the strategic global partnership. It has very significant meaning for the bilateral relationship. 2000 May 2000, after the bilateral countries got a setback by the Japanese sanction against India, Prime Minister Modi visited India and marked the starting point for the subsequent improvement of bilateral relations. The global partnership has been announced. And in April 2005, when Prime Minister Koizumi visited India, they announced the Japan-India partnership in New Asian area. It focused on the global strategic focus, reinforced strategic focus of the global partnership, not only economic size. The Eightfold Initiative provided institutional mechanism to develop strategic cooperation between two countries. And in that year, Japan succeeded in inviting India, along with Australia and New Zealand, as a founding member of the East Asian Summit held in Kuala Lumpur in December 2005. And next year, 2006, two countries announced the Japan-India Strategic Global Partnership. It gained much importance against the background of geopolitical change in Asia triggered by China. It was confirmed that both prime ministers would visit each other country every other year. But since then, along with their summit through prime ministers, mutual annual dialogue at the ministerial levels have been institutionalized. In 2008, Japan and India formed the framework for the security cooperation between two countries. And 2009, annual sub-cabinet senior official 2+2 dialogue and annual bilateral naval exercise have studies. The deepening bilateral relationship between mutual trust is very important. Japan and India have established a framework for long-term cooperation in the field of both economy and national security. And the summit meeting taking place every year is very instrumental in confirming and implementing the bilateral collaboration in Indian infrastructure. Otherwise, the gigantic DMIC will not be studied. And Japan has been eager to diversify its sources of rare earths after China curtailed its rare earth supply to Japan over the Senkaku incident in September 2010. The import of rare earths from India will start on next February, which will account for 15% of total Japanese demand. And Japan set out the new policy on overseas transfer of defense equipment and technology this April. Discussion of sale and technology transfer of US-2 amphibious rescue and research aircraft to India is likely to move faster. And well, both two countries, as Asia's two largest and oldest democracy, share their belief that the two countries will serve as key anchors for advancing peace, stability, and prosperity in future Asia. And Japan has interest in emerging India. Japan regards a strong tie-up with India as important for its own growth strategy and Abenomics. And quite recently, Prime Minister Modi visited Japan from August 13 to September 3, accompanied by a strong delegation of corporate leaders. His high regards to Japan and his close personal bond with Mr. Abe have left a good impression to Japanese people. The Modi government is strongly committed to enhancing manufacturing and infrastructure, where Japan has already left its footprint in India. So naturally, India regards Japan as a key partner to upgrade its manufacturing and infrastructure. Japanese corporate leaders have a high expectation for the power of execution for Mr. Modi. Mr. Modi was successful in appealing to Japanese corporate leaders to come and make in India. When Modi made an address, 2,000 Japanese corporate leaders gathered. It's very amazing. Then both leaders adopted the Tokyo Declaration, elevating the bilateral relationship to a special strategic and global partnership. While stressing further progress in security partnership, the main focus was in consolidating bilateral economic tie-up through expanding Japanese investment into India. The highlight of the Tokyo Declaration is, one, doubling Japanese FDI and the number of companies in India within 5 years. That's a Japanese size goal. And Japan providing 3.3 trillion yen, almost $35 billion in public and private financing to India over the next 5 years. Japan pledged such a financing. And as for the security matters, both countries confirmed the importance of regularization of bilateral maritime exercises, and Japan continues participation in India-US Malabar series of exercises. And both countries decided to explore to hold foreign ministerial dialogue between Japan India, and US. Finally, the prospects and challenge ahead. Japan FDI into India has recently expanded widely in many areas. Well, speeding up the deregulation and reducing red tape under the Modi government, I think it's a very important key for further accelerating Japanese investment in India. Under the strategic and global partnership, both security and economic relationship exerts a synergy effect on consolidating the bilateral relationships. Well, China is the most important trade partner for both Japan and India. So both countries will consolidate their bilateral relations with striking a balance between their security needs and economic interest. And lastly, Japan in the people-to-people exchanges are still quite limited. Japan has only about 600 Indian students and Japan sent only 60 students to India, while Japan have 80 Chinese students and sent 18,000 students to China. So the bilateral people-to-people exchange very, very limited. So to consolidate India-Japan cooperation further and bring huge benefits for the both countries, so the people-to-people exchange should be promoted using every possible channel. Okay. Thank you for your listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Professor Kojima, if I can ask a little bit about your first point in your conclusion about deregulation and reducing red tape being critical to enhancing business relations. Are there also tax incentives, for instance, that the Indian government can encourage? Are there discussions either at the national level or at the state level? What kind of discussions are going on, or is this the fiscal side is not something that's being discussed?
I'm not sure whether such tax matters have been discussed, but many Japanese people expect their service, good and service tax should be implemented as soon as possible. As for in India, the tax rates are different from state to state. It's very complicated. So in order to integrate the whole complicated indirect taxes, so goods and services taxes very, very recommendable. So India has committed to implement such a tax, but still not realized. So I think many Japanese people expect Modi government to implement such the GST, good and services tax. Yeah. Yeah.
I have just one more question. Sorry. Here's what I was hoping I could do, since I can control the microphone. I was hoping that we can have a couple of questions from the floor for each speaker. I'm going to ask Pratap Mehta to speak after this. We'll break very briefly, 5-10 minutes, and then we'll come back and listen to the other three speakers. Does that seem fair? Instead of holding off questions until the very, very end. I think would that make sense? Okay, good. So my final question to him, the number that you cited about the 6,000 Indian students in Japan and 60 Japanese students.
600, yeah.
600, I'm sorry, 600. And then that's even worse on the other side of the Japanese side with only 60 students. Yeah. This is a problem.
Yeah.
But what can be done? I mean, what are some of the solutions that, I mean, are we?
Yeah, we have more Pakistani or Bangladesh, Sri Lanka students in Japan than Indian students. I think Indian students more likely to go to in the States or UK or Australia. The problem in Japan universities, a majority universities, they only teach in Japanese language. So in order to study in Japanese student university, Indian students have to learn Japanese language, the additional burden. So another reason is when Indian students are employed in Japanese companies, they cannot see a clear career path in the future. That's another problem. So the solution is, I think, two kinds. We have to provide more classes in English in Japanese universities, and the Japanese companies have to employ foreign people, including Indians, at a very high level. Yeah, that is a very important point. Yeah.
Okay. The floor is yours if you have any questions. Yes. If you can wait for a microphone, please.
Thank you for a very comprehensive presentation. There's one area where actually, which you didn't touch upon, which is the pharmaceutical industry. Japan has a very interesting and original pharmaceutical industry, and India is the largest producer of generic pharmaceuticals. And I would have thought this would be a natural synergy between the two countries. And this would tie in with education as well, because biochemistry and subjects like that, I assume, are more on the Roman script than in any cryptographic language. Thank you.
Well, in India-Japan EPA, both countries agrees that the national treatment should be provided for the Indian company for the applying for registration of a generic medicine in Japan. But the implementation is not started. It's a bureaucratic reason, and also the another reason is in Japan the share of generic is low, not so preferred up to now. I think two reasons explain why generic export from India to Japan has not started up to now. But Japanese large pharmaceutical companies such as Eisai or other companies set up their own company factory in India, and also Indian companies set up their factory in Japan. So in the future, I think the pharmaceutical trade between two countries will be sure to expand. Yes. That's my answer, okay. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Now we'll move on to how this all fits into the bigger picture of diplomatic, political security with Pratap.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be here, and Kojima-san has made my task easier by giving such a comprehensive presentation. So I'll just be very telegraphic and just kind of lay out a few propositions for us to think about. India-Japan relations, as Kojima-san said, have always been very cordial, and certainly Japan's contribution to India's development has been absolutely extraordinary, and certainly in terms of public visibility, in terms of garnering goodwill. I think there's a new Pew survey out of attitudes in India and Japan is most liked country, one of the most liked countries in India by an order of magnitude. Partly, I think, driven by these prestige projects like the Delhi Metro and so forth. But it has to be said that until very recently, this relationship was of very little strategic interest to the global community. In India, there was actually, at a strategic level, a negative perception of Japan, which was Japan was the paradigm case of an economically very powerful country that, in Indian perception at least, had very little strategic autonomy, and therefore there was very little incentive to engage with it. And frankly, I think in the early 1990s, I think India also had the sense that compared to the United States or even Europe, Japan was perhaps a little bit slower in recognizing the significance of India's economic growth rates and its kind of rise and its aspirations to acquire a seat at the high table. I think it's fair to say that in the last 5 to 6 years, but I think culminating in Mr. Modi's visit to Japan, there has been a fundamental transformation in this relationship and really extraordinary expectations. And what I'll try and do in the next 10 minutes is just try and lay out a framework for how should we think about the transformation in this relationship and how it fits in a sense, in a broader Asian context. I think the first point to recognize, and I think this is absolutely basic to thinking about all of India's relationships from now on, is this government in particular is going to be single-mindedly focused on economic growth. And the three elements of that are very important are energy, infrastructure, and manufacturing leading to job creation. Almost all our India's foreign policy engagements will be driven by this priority. Now, in order to fulfill this priority, the two most important countries actually happen to be Japan and China, both in terms of the availability of potential investment in India's infrastructure sector. Frankly, there's not a great deal of expectation of investment flowing in India's infrastructure sector from the United States, for example. And to that extent, even on the economic dimension, right? And Kojima-san laid out very clearly, India has deep trade relations with China, and although the investment relations are perhaps a little bit less than what the Chinese would like. But the fact of the matter is, India's first priorities is securing space for its economic development, and particularly around these three poles. And any country that helps India on these three is basically going to have, let's put it this way, strategic advantage in engagement with India, right? The second, I think, proposition, which I think the Indian establishment is working with, is there is clearly a massive realignment going on in Asia. And what are the elements of this realignment? I think it's important to focus on that. The first is that there is some uncertainty about what the United States' role in Asia is going to be looking ahead. Although the United States has talked about the pivot to Asia, I think it's becoming increasingly clear, or let's put it this way, it's becoming increasingly less clear what that actually means in terms of concrete strategic actions and strategic partnerships, right? And clearly that is one of the contexts in which Japan is also sort of looking to, as it were, come out in Asia, acquire a little bit more foreign policy and strategic autonomy. Although I think in India the view is that it probably can't go very far so long as it's tied to the current relationship it has with the United States. I think the second proposition that India has taken for granted is that Asia is a very dynamic economic region, but the fact of the matter is that it is also a region still marked by historical memories of the 1940s all across. I mean, India, Pakistan, Japan, China, Japan, Korea, and potentially dangerous territorial disputes. Those are just facts of life, right? And for all of the economic dynamism of the region has not found a way of, it has found a way of managing these disputes. It has found a way of managing, as it were, these historical relationships and resentments, but it has not yet found a way of actually overcoming them in a way in which you can confidently say that a new security architecture is going to emerge, right? So what is going to be therefore the strategy for peace in Asia? It will depend on actually very subtle alignments and realignments rather than the creation of a single architectonic regional, in a sense, regional architecture, right? I think in India there's a sense that India is increasingly becoming important to Japan because, let's put it this way, the Indian leverage allows Japan a kind of coming out in the Asian context. I think it probably has the best relationship with India amongst almost all the Asian countries, and so in that sense, if it wants to make tentative move towards greater defense exports, greater naval cooperation, India is actually a very, very strong candidate, probably the only major candidate actually at the moment, right? So I think India sort of takes that for granted, as it were, that this is a historic opportunity. Having said that, for the very same reason, right, that a stable regional architecture or regional institutions is not going to be possible in the near run in Asia unless some of these historical relationships are untangled. I think India recognizes that what it'll have to do is a very artful balancing act between all the powers that are invested in and active in Asia. And I think to Indian minds, in some ways, India is actually in a win-win situation. It's in a win-win situation, which is to say that almost all the powers, including China, are at the moment willing to court India. It does not see its relationship with China or Japan or the United States as a zero-sum relationship. In fact, quite the contrary. I think part of its strategic outreach to Japan is driven by a sense that if you are actually proactive in engaging Japan, it might actually incite the Chinese to court you even more. And I think we'll get a little bit of test of that later this month when President Xi Jinping sort of in a sense visits India. But certainly in Indian minds, I don't think on any conception of the strategic partnership, is there a sense that this is a zero-sum game, that we will be in a position to have to kind of choose between, as it were, Japan or China, whatever that actually means. And I think India believes that in the final analysis, neither will the United States or Japan, for that matter, that the nature of their economic interdependence with China is actually sufficient that there will be some rough edges to those relationships, but it's hard to see them polarizing. Or at least that's the assumption on which we are operating. So in that sense, India, you can call it by any other name, India is actually going to pursue its traditional policy of non-alignment. And by non-alignment may mean something very specific, which is it's going to be a zone of great power agreement. Whatever the Chinese-Japanese tensions, India will say, you figure out your tensions, but you can both agree that you don't want tensions with us, at least not to the same extent. And the same is true of the United States. So it's going to be a zone of great power agreement. I think that's the position it wants to kind of put itself in, and that's, if it can pull it off, it's not a bad position to be in. But it realizes that in order to do that, it can't take, in a sense, a passive position, which is just let the great powers kind of figure out the Asian security architecture or whatever. It'll have to be on issues that matter to it, court alliances and make cross-cutting connections. And I think with Japan, I think the Indian interest in maritime security and particularly open shipping lanes and an open maritime order is particularly particularly paramount. I think that's one area where you could see increased Japan-India cooperation as a way of sending signals to any other power that might be interested that it's not going to be easy to unilaterally rewrite the rules of the current world, at least the current Asian architecture. I'll just end quickly with what are the potential sort of pitfalls in this relationships. I think, as Kojima-san hinted, how dynamic the India-Japan relationship is going to depend on one factor principally, which is India's growth rate. I think India thinks rightly that its best foreign policy is getting to a 7.5 to 8% growth rate, and if it actually gets that, many of these other concerns about engagement with India will actually sort of wither away. Now, obviously, it will need to cut red tape. Mr. Modi will have to deliver on an implementation strategy. But I think the way India thinks of balancing in Asia is not so much in the kind of classical sense of aligning with one power against another. I think the way it thinks of balancing in Asia is that if India does reasonably well, grows at 7 to 8% for a significant period, at least a decade or so more, that itself provides a kind of existential balance in Asia. It gives other countries in Asia other options as a place to invest, as a place to trade, and potentially, although India's delivery record has been poor so far, as a source of investment in building infrastructure and so forth. So, that's the conception of balancing it is operating with. So, lot hinges on in a sense its economic performance. I think the last thought, and this is in a sense the obvious one, which is that India has historically been very reluctant to enter into alliances. That was kind of part of the non-alignment sort of story. It has all kinds of flexible architecture, strategic partnerships with different kinds of countries. And I think that is going to remain the case for the foreseeable future, although, there is a lot of talk of a kind of India, Japan, Australia nexus within the Asia based on democratic values and so forth. I think India will be pushed into it only if its relationship with China deteriorates to a point, right, where it has no other option. I think in public perception and in Indian media, there is a lot of sense about, that India and China relationships have taken a nosedive, so forth, as have Chinese relationship with most other Asian partners. But I think at the level of the leadership, there's a lot more sort of sophistication and sanguineness about being able to actually manage the relationship with China. And therefore, I think India's interest is going to be in constructing an architecture in Asia where no power is placed in a position to actually have to choose between the great powers. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Could you elaborate a little bit more about India being pushed into an India, Japan, Australia trilateral alliance if there are no other options? What are some of the situations that may be triggered?
So I think the only situation I can think of, or let's say two situations, right, which is, one is if there is a perception that China is going to rewrite the rules of the current world order, whether it's trade rules, whether it's maritime rules, right, in a way that produces a global architecture that is less inclusive, less open, and allows less space for participation. Right? I think that's one circumstances where you look for coalitions to, in a sense, block that possibility. Although I don't think I don't think India thinks that's a very high probability outcome. The second one is, in a sense, the obvious one. If for some reason, although it hasn't happened in 40, 50 years or so, if for some reason the territorial dispute that India has with China over its boundary deteriorates to a point that there is a real possibility of Chinese incursion into Indian territory, or at least a threat of that. As I said, again, I don't think there is a sense in India that this is a very high probability outcome. And in fact, I think, on some assessments, there's a sense that the China-Japan relationship is far more fragile than the India-China relationship at one level. For historical reasons. So I think those are the only two circumstances in which India might be pushed to, as it were, make a very stark choice. But otherwise, I don't think it feels that it's in a position to actually be forced to choose.
Okay, questions? Yes. Could you hold on just 1 minute? We're actually recording this, which is why I'm asking if you can wait a minute. Sorry.
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired State Department. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the maritime security, maritime rules agenda in East Asia, and as a possible area where you might see some confrontation with China over the rules. Which side is India going to be on? You're going to be with Japan, the U.S., and some of the maritime Asian states, or are you going to sort of stand off on that? Or it seems that some way or other you're going to be pushed into a situation where you might have to confront China a little bit more than India may want to.
Right. No, I mean, I think you're right. Which is, I think on maritime, India's position is actually quite clear. I mean, it is closer to Japan and the US and many other Asian states, and the core normative interest is in keeping as open a maritime architecture as possible, which also means, I mean, very, very pragmatically, no country has the power to, in a sense, unilaterally declare no-go zones and those kinds of things, right? Just as an example. So I think in terms of actually the negotiating position and taking a stand, very clear stand, right, on those rules. I think India's position is actually quite clear on that, right? I think the tricky question, which is a question as much for the US and probably what India does will in part depend on what the US does, is if that confrontation reaches, I mean, what are the instruments you can actually use, right, to secure that open order? To what extent is the United States, or what is the threshold at which the United States will actually precipitate a confrontation? And it's not clear to most Asian powers what that red line actually is. So I think in terms of actual actions, it will depend on how those red lines get articulated, in a sense, as we go along, and what might be the instruments appropriate to achieving an open maritime architecture. But I think a lot will depend on where the U.S. actually comes out on that, or what are the circumstances under which the U.S. would consider specific actions, rather than just a kind of statement of positions.
We're going to take whatever questions we have together. So if we can go to Kikuchi-san and then to the back. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kikuchi. And just a little comment. First, I'd like to remember Mr. Chandra Bose as the major, let's say, ally of Imperial Japan until the end of World War II, when he met an unfortunate accidental death. But India and Japan were almost allies towards the end of World War II. That's one thing. You also mentioned that the historical issues between China and Japan is more serious than that of between China and India. And I beg to differ a little bit, because there is no substance to the current issues that China is raising with Japan, because the government of Japan today is quite different from the government that invaded China during and prior to World War II. if that kind of issue is going to be so key, crucial, then India would still have to be fighting Britain, for example, for its many centuries of colonial rule. That's one point. And also territorially, these are issues, Senkaku, nobody lives there as compared to a serious land area between China and India that is being disputed. So, and historically, Japan is essentially part of the Chinese culture zone. It has always been, and it still is. We still use Chinese characters to this day. And many people read ancient Chinese history books on their free time in Japanese, of course, but it's still about China.
You might, I don't.
So that's the sort of the comment. The one question I have looking forward on economic growth is that when I used to work in the World Bank, and again, they used to separate East Asia and South Asia, which I think is foolish. India and China should not be separated, but they used to. But the population at that time, when I worked there, was about 600 million. And today you are well over 1.2 billion. And unlike China, where they did set a policy of limiting further population growth, or I'd say explosion, I don't see that effort in the part of India. And when India attains a threshold income level to afford air conditioning or even minimum motorized vehicles, how is the world going to sustain that kind of resource demand? That's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, I have just a little question which regards access to global markets. Would India in the future prefer bilateral trade agreements, or would they like to become partners in bigger systems like, let's say, TTIP or TPP? How is India's role going to be?
Thank you for those questions and comments. And your comment was very helpful because it allows me to sort of clarify something I spoke very, very quickly, and I think it's important. Obviously, the India-China dispute is important, not just because of the scale of the border, and compared to that, at least in territorial terms, the dispute with Japan is actually sort of significant, but also because of the fact that at least so long as the Dalai Lama is in India and there is a Tibetan exile movement, in some senses it does put pressure on the India-China relationship. I think the sense in India is that in part, the trajectory of that relationship will in part be determined by what happens internally inside Tibet. And whenever there is, in a sense, contestation inside Tibet, the India-China relationship sort of dips a little bit, because there's this kind of obvious assumption that there must be sort of some link, right? So in that sense, it's very intimately bound. On the other hand, and maybe this is a second-hand reading, India looms much less, I think, in the Chinese imagination than Japan does, psychologically and otherwise. And as you know, inhabiting cultural zones can often make smaller conflicts much more intractable. If that were an argument, India-Pakistan would be solved, in a sense, long time ago. So I think, in a sense, I think the big challenge, right, I think for Asia as a whole is, for all our economic progress, for this absolutely extraordinary transformation that Asia has seen, in terms of our historical memories and imagination, we just can't seem to escape the 1940s. At some level, if you think about being able to overcome the across, as I said, from India, Pakistan to Japan, Korea, Japan, China, the Asian architecture would look, in a sense, very, very different. And so I would not discount the importance of that psychological imagination that still binds, that still ties us, I think, in some ways, perhaps more than it should. I think the question about, obviously the question about environmental constraints to growth is a very, very important one, and certainly one articulation of it is going to be in the climate change negotiations. Again, not a place where India and Japan see eye to eye, to be very honest. India would like Japanese technology for clean energy, but certainly not, I think in terms of India's pecking order, Japan and EU are probably kind of outliers. India is closer to the United States and China in wanting a bottoms-up, non-binding kind of agreement. So we'll see how that plays out. But I think the two big players in that story are United States and China. If the United States and China can come to some agreement on pushing climate change negotiations forward, I think India will respond. On the question about trade, short answer is so. India's first priority is going to be to retain, in a sense, some domestic room for maneuver. It just, in a sense, depending on your interpretation of it, but India has made a strong case for at least allowing or at least hastening the discussions on food subsidies and farmer subsidies, and that is a huge domestic political issue. The scale of it is quite important. I think the interesting thing on TPP is, obviously it worried India that if there were going to be these two massive trading blocs, the TPP and the Transatlantic Partnership, and with India and China shut out, that would be actually quite damaging. I think, interestingly, there seems to be the sense that the TPP is not going to happen anytime soon. So we'll see. So, but it is certainly an argument in India. One of the critiques of India's position on the WTO is that you're actually strengthening the case for. India had a great fascination for FTAs, like many countries, but I think there's beginning to be a bit of a rethink on the FTAs, not just for its implications for the global trading system, but also because you actually end up probably with a worse bargain in many of the FTAs.
All right. We're going to take a break. It is now 10 past 3. If we can come back at 3:20, and then we'll resume our conversation with Nagao-san. Yes? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
いいですよ。もちろんそれはもう構わないですよ。全く大島先生に交渉してください。時計と。
Just get some.